Dear class, welcome back to International Relations Lectures. Right now, we will talk about the theoretical basis of international development. Did these ideas that nations could develop emerge out of the Bretton Woods 1944 era of thinking, or are these much older? So I will propose these are based on older ideas. Let's take a look. To start with, theories about economic growth have existed since the 1700s. You have Adam Smith. He wrote The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Very famous book. He is British, and the book becomes important to nations who are trying to industrialize, especially in Western Europe. They're looking at this model and they're saying, wow, he's a genius. Let's adopt this model. So essentially, Smith is promoting the idea that you have to focus on industrialization, and by that he means division of labor. So if before a shoe was being produced by one person, and it would take the person, say, 20 hours to make one shoe, one pair of shoes, say. Adam Smith was saying you can make it much faster if you just share the work process with 10 other people. Each of them can focus on a small part, pass it to the next person. Small part, pass it to the next person, okay? In this way, you can actually produce not just one shoe, but perhaps 1,000 shoes in 20 hours, right? So he's saying you can make more money if you just think about division of labor. And so companies, rather factory owners, are now thinking about industrializing. They're thinking of using division of labor and hiring hundreds and thousands of workers and, creating a large amount of production. And so for Adam Smith, it's not just production, but the ability to sell your products in the market. And what do you need for that? You need free trade. You need to have increased trade with the world, and you can only do it if you have free trade. And so he is advocating for the entire economic system and the state to help factory owners do this around the world. Okay, so this is generally what his proposal is about. So he's saying, yes, you can have more wealth if you modernize your agricultural system, so you can have more food production, but you really need to be focusing on industrialization, and division of labor is the way. You have to increase trade with the world. You also have to have banks. If you don't have banks, who's going to finance the development of industry? Who's going to finance the development of merchants? Who's going to finance and protect the navies that are needed to protect trade? So all these ideas. Smith is also concerned about what is going to happen with this experiment of industrialization. Is it going to work out in the future? Will labor and factory owners have conflicts? Will the state help factory owners? What about the banks? Who are the banks going to side with? Will workers be able to assert their fair say as both workers and consumers? So Smith is thinking about all these questions. And he says, yes, they will all fight for their own interests. And this is how they're going to achieve a balance. He calls it the invisible hand, meaning that people are so self-interested that they will eventually fight for their rights. And by doing so, they will make sure that workers are heard, that factory owners are heard, and that the state interests are heard. in the long run, it will all work out. So this is a more positive model of economic growth and development. The more negative model emerges in the 1800s. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are actually just two names, and they became famous because Marx was a professor. He had gone to university in Germany. He was kicked out because of his writings. At this time, the workers' movement in Europe had become very, very active. Why? Because working conditions in industries were so poor that workers were becoming unionized. They were becoming activists. They were demanding different kinds of governance. They were tired of the state protecting industrialists. And this is happening not just in Europe, but also in the US. So the idea of class conflict, even though Marx and Engels are known for it, actually kind of comes from the writings of Adam Smith, because Adam Smith is talking about the tension in his book as well about whether these groups are going to get along. The producers, the workers, the capitalists, the people with the money. Are they going to get along? What about the state role? And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are writing 100 years after, or rather, maybe 50 to 100 years after, and they are commenting on what they are seeing in their time. It's much more concentrated development of industrialization at that time, right? In England and Germany especially. So when they write the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and Das Kapital or Capital in 1867, you have, very, very organized, large industrial setups. And the situation of workers is very, very bad at this time. In the US, you can look at the similar time and, just look at the Carnegie steel mills. There's a link inside the weekly lessons folder. So do watch the Carnegie steel mill video. The average workday is 18 hours in the US. And at the Carnegie Steel Mill, people are working 364 days a year. This is called the robber baron phase of industrialization. So Marx and Engels are examining industrialization in Western Europe and argue that workers are overexploited. They're extremely underpaid. They're overworked. And this is not a happy situation. Class conflict is happening at every moment. Workers are rioting, they're refusing to work, and they're getting fired because the industrialists have more power. They also have influence with the government, and police are being used to beat up the workers. And so workers are also highly political at this time. And if you look at some of these writers in Marxist.org, you will see that Marx and Engels were actually just two out of hundreds of writers who were, workers who became writers and activists in the 1800s and the 1700s. And they are basically arguing for different kinds of government system in Europe. So do check them out. So Marx and Engels argue that no corporation or industry, right, will be fair to workers unless it is owned by workers. At least that's their thinking. They think that if workers take over and replace these horrible capitalists who are running the show, then things will be different. They argue the same is needed regarding the state. They think that the state is basically an executive committee of the capitalist group, right? The bankers and the factory owners, and they're running the show. And so, to have a state that actually works for workers, you have to replace the state by workers. Workers have to take over government, right? So, overthrow of the monarchies and the aristocrats. So, Marx actually sounds like, he's calling for radical change in the political system of Europe, right? And this is in the 1800s. So he became feared by the monarchs. He became feared by the despotic rulers. And so in the Western Europe and also in the US, you will see that Marx becomes a dirty word. However, many of his ideas and his criticism of the industrial setup were accurate observations. They were accurate and much needed. For example, Marx was opposed to the 18-hour workday, the level of exploitation of labor, the very low pays, the making the workers work for 364 days out of the year. So many European nations, but also nations around the planet, have adopted some of Marx's ideas without telling you. So workers can own shares in the US of their own companies, right? Through the stock option. Some workers, by virtue of being workers, are given stock options by their companies. If you are a full-time worker, definitely that stock option becomes possible. You can also buy shares of your company. So if you think that you're being not paid enough, buy some shares and sit on them for 30 years or so. When you retire, see if you made money. You can retire on these shares, right? So the idea is that basically you can own the corporations, just like Marx and Engels had proposed that workers should take over the corporations. And by becoming owners, you can become decision makers, right? You can meet at the shareholder meetings. You can, vote for who should be the CEO, and you have all kinds of power. Today, the work week is 40 hours, right? If you work 40 hours at any company, they owe you healthcare benefits, right? You know that if you work part-time, they don't owe you that same benefit. If you work at a university, you might also get educational benefits, such as free tuition for your kids or for yourself or your spouse. If someone works more than 40 hours, they are to be paid overtime. So all kinds of benefits are in the system due to the Marx and Engels critique and the workers' movements. So today we see that the work week situation has improved. Let's see what else is going on. Today, if you look at the economic growth models, or actually the economic development models, you will see the influence of Marx and Engels, or you will see the influence of Adam Smith. So the direction, if you take the optimism model of Adam Smith, that industrialization will take you into a better stage as far as your country is concerned, it will develop positively. Just leave it to industrialization and trade and free trade. Then you will be following the path that the liberals have adopted today. And that is, following the writings of Adam Smith and also W. Rostow, who has come up with this theory called stages of growth. And essentially, Rostow's new spin on it is that he also says population growth rates have to be reduced. That's the only way you can increase the actual mathematical value of economic growth, because you can be increasing your production, but if your population is growing, then your economic growth rate won't be as high. Anyways, so other than Rostow, I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who agree with Rostow, and this starts in the 70s and goes on until the 90s. And then this whole Rostow stages of growth model kind of crumbles from within because the proponents are now being critiqued by their own students because they cannot show positives. There are problems with the Rostow model. One, the nations that were said to become richer are not necessarily becoming richer by following the Rostow theory. So Marxist and dependency scholars, these guys are basically following the Marx and Engels critique, but they're adding the experience of third world nations. And they're looking at these nations in Asia, Africa, Caribbean, and the Americas, and they're saying, look, these nations aren't just nations without any history. They've gone through European colonialism. The European countries have come down to these countries, stolen their natural resources for hundreds of years. They've taken over, taken the wealth of this country. They've sold, produced all these products. They've stolen the resources and shipped all the money back to Europe. So very little has been done to actually improve the situation in those colonies. And so if you're talking about why countries are poor, it's not because they were like that always. They used to have very rich, empires, but actually they've been underdeveloped. So they introduced this term called underdevelopment. And these ideas are influential for scholars who are looking at the current state of international development. They're saying, oh, third world countries since the 1990s, look at them. Look at actually the time period between 1950 and 1990. Not only have the new nations been created, but they experienced colonialism for 200-300 years before, which we didn't take into account when we proposed Rostow's idea that just do open markets, just do industrialization, and just improve your food production, that's enough. We didn't consider that these nations are now poor because all the resources have been shipped out. So are they poor today because they didn't have industrialization before? No, they're poor because there was industrialization, but all the profits kept going to Europe. And so it's not helping these countries, right? It didn't help the countries. So right now, if you look at the period between 1950 and the 1990, essentially, that 40 years were basically forced forms of development, where you had the US and Western Europe again forcing new kinds of rules on these countries, forcing them to lower protectionism within local industries. and telling these countries that you have to follow our path of development or you cannot get any money for development purposes. So let's stop here. And in next lectures, we'll talk about international security.